On May 3rd, 2007, a little girl vanished without a trace from her family's vacation apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal. This was no ordinary disappearance. It became one of the most disturbing and twisted mysteries of the 21st century. Madeleine McCann, only 3 years old at the time, was last seen by her parents, Jerry and Kate McCann, when they went for dinner at a nearby restaurant, leaving their children sleeping in the apartment. What followed was a nightmare that shook the world and sparked one of the largest and most highly publicized missing person cases in history. Madeleine's disappearance didn't just shake her family. It ignited a storm of theories, intense media coverage, and countless speculations. The quiet beach town of Praia da Luz, usually a place of relaxation and peaceful vacations, was thrown into chaos. As the hours turned into days, and then into weeks, the world held its breath, waiting for any clue that would lead to her whereabouts. But no trace of Madeleine McCann was found. Her parents, heartbroken and desperate, faced not only the agony of losing their daughter, but also mounting pressure from the media and the public. Questions were raised almost immediately. How could this happen in a supposedly safe and peaceful place? The police started investigating, but their efforts seemed to stall. And as the investigation progressed, suspicions grew, not just about the possible abduction, but also about the family's involvement. In the early days of the case, the focus was on Madeleine being abducted. It seemed the most plausible explanation, especially when it was revealed that there was no sign of forced entry into the apartment. This led to the theory that someone from outside the family was responsible for taking Madeleine. But as the investigation unfolded, things took a dark turn. The McCanns were drawn into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Their actions, such as leaving their children alone in the apartment while they dined nearby, raised questions about their parenting, and soon they found themselves the subjects of intense media scrutiny. By September 2007, just months after Madeleine's disappearance, the case took a shocking twist. The McCanns were named arguidos, official suspects in the investigation. The media storm intensified, and the world began to wonder if the parents, in fact, had something to do with their daughter's disappearance. Theories about a tragic accident, cover-up, and even intentional harm were floated, further complicating the case. The truth seemed more elusive than ever, but no matter where the investigation led, one fact remained clear. The life of little Madeleine McCann and the lives of her parents would never be the same again. The mystery of what truly happened to Madeleine remains unsolved to this day, with new theories, investigations, and public debates emerging every few years. What happened to Madeleine McCann? Was she taken by a stranger, or did something far darker take place within the walls of that vacation apartment? The case of Madeleine McCann continues to captivate and haunt the world, even as the years pass by, and the answers remain as elusive as ever. The story of Madeleine McCann took a dark turn when it became clear that the investigation was not as straightforward as anyone had hoped. While the world waited for a breakthrough, the pressure on the Portuguese police grew. Despite the large-scale search efforts, Madeleine's whereabouts remained a mystery. The police combed through the area, interviewed hundreds of people, and followed countless leads, but nothing concrete materialized. As days turned into weeks, frustration and uncertainty took hold. The media frenzy that surrounded the case only added to the chaos. Journalists from around the world arrived in Praia da Luz, setting up camp in the small town, with cameras pointed at every corner. The attention was overwhelming, and soon, the McCanns found themselves at the center of an international spotlight. Yet, amidst the intense scrutiny, there was one issue that stood out: the behavior of the police and their handling of the investigation. Early on, there were reports of missteps that became a point of contention. One major failure was the loss of key evidence, including security footage from nearby cameras and potential witnesses. The police were criticized for not acting quickly enough and for missing critical clues that could have led to Madeleine's location. But the real blow to the investigation came when, in September 2007, The McCanns were officially named suspects in their daughter's disappearance. This decision was a devastating blow to the case, and public opinion began to shift dramatically. The idea that Madeleine's own parents could be involved in her disappearance was a shock to the public, and it took the case to an entirely new level of suspicion. The theory of an abduction was pushed aside by the media in favor of theories of guilt. People began to wonder if Madeleine's parents had been hiding something, or if something had gone terribly wrong during that fateful night. The McCanns, once hopeful and determined to find their daughter, were now forced to defend their innocence, while the world pointed fingers at them. The case was further complicated by the fact that there were no physical signs of any abduction, no DNA evidence, no witnesses, no ransom note. It was as though Madeleine had vanished into thin air. And the more time passed, the more suspicion grew. Were the McCanns really innocent, or was there something darker hidden beneath the surface? The media, eager for answers, began to vilify the parents, creating a storm of criticism that further clouded the search for the truth. While the McCanns were being dragged through the mud, new theories started to emerge. The public was torn between believing that Madeleine had been kidnapped by a stranger, or that the abduction was part of a more intricate conspiracy. People speculated that the McCanns had been involved in a cover-up. The possibility of a family secret began to circulate, and the case shifted from a simple missing persons investigation to something far more complex. No one seemed to know who to trust. Was it the McCanns who had failed their daughter, or was someone else out there pulling the strings? And in the midst of it all, the most chilling question of all, what happened to Madeleine McCann? As the investigation continued to stall and the McCanns remained in the spotlight, the case began to take on a life of its own. The lack of progress only deepened the mystery. As weeks turned into months, the media machine kept turning, fueled by theories, speculation, and sensational headlines. Yet, no one could provide answers. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann was becoming a global obsession, but the search for the truth seemed as hopeless as ever. But amid the swirling rumors and theories, a chilling realization began to settle in. There was no clear direction. The police were in disarray. The McCanns were stuck in a never-ending battle for their reputation, and the public was divided. As the months passed, without any concrete evidence, the emotional toll on the McCann family only grew. They were forced to continue the search for their daughter, despite facing overwhelming pressure from all sides. Throughout the following years, the McCanns would continue their fight to find their daughter. They would hire private investigators, they would push for new leads, and they would keep hope alive despite the mounting odds. Yet with each passing year, the chances of finding Madeleine seemed to fade. The case of Madeleine McCann remained one of the most haunting and tragic mysteries of the modern era, with more questions than answers. While theories continued to swirl and new developments were announced regularly, the core of the mystery remained unsolved. What happened to Madeleine McCann? Was she kidnapped, or did something far darker occur? The question continues to haunt the world to this day, and as the years go by, the hope for answers grows fainter. What started as a simple case of a missing child had turned into a deeply twisted and tragic mystery that would forever leave its mark on the world. The twists and turns in the Madeleine McCann case seemed endless, and with each passing year, the theories surrounding her disappearance grew more bizarre and unsettling. Despite the lack of evidence, rumors continued to circulate, making the case even more convoluted. In the absence of new leads, the public's imagination took over. Theories ranged from the idea that Madeleine had been taken by a pedophile ring to speculation about secret family connections or even dark political motives. Every time the investigation seemed to lose steam, new whispers emerged, and the search for answers continued. The emotional toll on the McCanns was immense. As parents, they had already suffered the unimaginable, losing their child, and now they were forced to face an onslaught of public judgment. The media did not let up. Every interview, every public appearance by Kate and Jerry McCann was scrutinized, and every word was dissected for signs of guilt. In a way, their efforts to find Madeleine were overshadowed by the constant speculation. The more they tried to push for answers, the more they were painted as suspects in a case that was shrouded in mystery. In 2008, the McCanns were officially cleared of any wrongdoing, but the damage had already been done. Their reputations had been irreparably damaged by the media frenzy, and the world continued to demand answers that seemed just out of reach. The couple continued their fight, publicly calling for more investigation into their daughter's case, but it became increasingly clear that no one knew where Madeleine was or what had really happened to her that night. As the case entered its second decade, new detective teams and private investigators were brought in the hopes of uncovering new evidence. Yet time was not on their side. Every year that passed without any new leads made it harder to believe that the case would ever be solved. New DNA evidence, fresh forensic reports, and even the discovery of potential sightings. Nothing provided a solid lead to close the case. Despite all the setbacks, the McCanns' resolve never wavered. They continued to speak out publicly, appearing on talk shows, news broadcasts, and even writing books to keep the public aware of Madeleine's story. But as the years went by, the spotlight on the case began to dim, and the media gradually moved on to other stories. However, Madeleine's name continued to echo in the background. She was no longer just a missing child. She had become a symbol of loss, justice, and the search for truth. By 2013, the case had officially gone cold, but the emotional scars were still fresh. Madeleine McCann had become a household name, and her story continued to haunt those who had followed it. It wasn't just the McCanns who were affected by this tragedy. The entire world had been impacted. The case represented something larger than just the search for one child. It was about a loss of innocence, a failure in the system, and a world that seemed unable to protect its most vulnerable. Madeleine's disappearance was a wake-up call for many, exposing the flaws in both the criminal justice system and the media, which was so quick to turn suspects into villains. But with each passing year, the public began to ask new questions. Was it too late for Madeleine to be found? Had the search efforts been misguided? And were there more sinister forces at play than anyone had imagined? Some of the more recent theories raised the possibility that the entire investigation had been manipulated to cover up something much darker. And while these ideas have not been substantiated, they continued to fuel the fire of speculation. For many, the haunting image of Madeleine McCann, the image of a smiling, innocent girl forever frozen in time, remained at the center of this mystery. But as the years continued to pass, it became increasingly clear that the case would likely never have closure. Madeleine's face still appeared on missing child posters across Europe, but without any solid evidence or new leads, her family's journey to find the truth became an unending fight against time, against public opinion, and against a system that seemed too broken to repair. Yet, despite the uncertainty and frustration, the McCanns kept their daughter's name alive. They remained the driving force behind the search for Madeleine, and no matter how many years passed, they would not give up. This was not just a search for a missing child. It was the search for justice, for accountability, and for the truth that had long been hidden in the shadows of the media storm. Madeleine McCann may have been lost to the world, but her story was far from over. The case of Madeleine McCann will likely remain one of the most disturbing mysteries of our time. As years go by and more potential leads are uncovered, the case continues to haunt us all. Was it an abduction, a tragic mistake, or something more sinister? The world may never know the truth, but the case of Madeleine McCann serves as a stark reminder that some stories never have the closure we wish for, and that even the brightest of futures can be shattered by a single night of darkness. As the years went on, the case of Madeleine McCann continued to haunt the world. Though new leads were few and far between, the media slowly moved on, shifting its attention to other missing persons cases and sensational stories. But the questions surrounding Madeleine's disappearance never truly disappeared. The the case remained unresolved, leaving behind a cloud of doubt and speculation. In 2017, after a decade of fruitless investigation, the UK's Metropolitan Police launched a new appeal for information, offering a reward for anyone with substantial evidence. It was a desperate attempt to reignite public interest and to keep Madeleine's story alive. Yet despite the renewed efforts, there were still no clear answers. Investigators scoured through old leads, examined newly discovered evidence, and even interviewed former suspects. But still, the truth eluded them. Public interest in the case seemed to ebb and flow with the arrival of new headlines or speculative theories. Some reports hinted that Madeleine had been abducted by a criminal gang. Others believed that she had somehow been hidden in plain sight, and some even suggested that the family's neighbors might have known more than they let on. Theories continued to evolve, but the mystery persisted, with no new developments to validate any of them. The media kept pushing for answers, but the case felt colder with every passing year. Throughout all of this, Madeleine's parents, Jerry and Kate, kept a quiet vigil. They were physically exhausted, emotionally scarred, but they refused to let the world forget their daughter. They maintained a sense of hope, even though they knew the odds of finding her were shrinking with every year that passed. They pushed for further investigation, and they continuously spoke out, despite the ongoing media scrutiny. As the years went by, the McCanns' public stance seemed to shift. Once driven by the hope that their daughter would be found alive, they now faced the reality that Madeleine may never return. Their focus changed from finding a lost child to simply wanting answers. They no longer sought the return of their daughter alone. They also wanted to know the truth behind her disappearance and to bring some form of justice, no matter how long it took. They were fighting not just for their daughter's return, but for closure. Despite this, new investigative efforts continued, and a few breaks in the case led to fresh hope, at least temporarily. In 2020, German investigators publicly stated that they had a new suspect in the case. Christian B., a convicted pedophile, was identified as a person of interest after evidence suggested he was in the area at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. This gave the McCanns a fleeting moment of hope, but once again, no tangible evidence was found to support these claims. In the midst of these developments, the McCanns remained as guardians of Madeleine's legacy. They wrote books about their daughter's life, her disappearance, and the emotional toll the search had taken on them. They even set up the Madeleine McCann Fund, which helps raise awareness about missing children and supports ongoing efforts to solve the case. Despite their tireless efforts, the tragedy of Madeleine McCann's disappearance still lingers like an open wound in the collective consciousness. Her case is a constant reminder of the vulnerabilities we all face and how easily an innocent life can be taken. But it also highlights the failures of the system, whether it's in the investigative processes, the media's portrayal of suspects, or the way families of missing children are often cast aside as they seek answers in the face of overwhelming odds. The case of Madeleine McCann is a reflection of how society deals with loss, justice, and unresolved questions. It forces us to question how we treat the most vulnerable among us and what happens when the systems we rely on to protect us fail. As the case continues, it reminds us that sometimes, even in the face of grief, hope, and resilience, the truth is simply out of reach. As the years stretched on, the case of Madeleine McCann became more than just a tragedy. It became an unresolved symbol of all that went wrong. The once optimistic search for a missing child turned into a symbol of failed justice and institutional flaws. By 2021, the case had reached its 14th year, with little to show for the vast resources poured into the investigation. Despite the media frenzy, public interest began to wane. Madeleine McCann's name, once at the forefront of every headline, now appeared less frequently. The world had grown tired, but the McCanns had not. They continued to speak up, hoping to break the silence and remind the world that their daughter's story was still unfinished. Even as new leads occasionally resurfaced, it became apparent that the case was slowly fading into the background of history. The German investigation, which had reignited hope in 2020, ultimately led nowhere, leaving the McCanns with more questions than answers. The new suspect, Christian B., continued to loom as the only possible lead, but authorities were unable to establish a direct connection between him and Madeleine's disappearance. The lack of solid evidence felt like yet another crushing blow to the McCanns and to the thousands of people who had followed their daughter's story closely over the years. But even when hope seemed lost, the McCanns remained steadfast. Jerry and Kate McCann publicly declared that they would never stop searching for answers. Their determination had not waned despite the passage of time, and their refusal to give up was rooted in the memory of their daughter, who was still missing. They fought on, not just for closure, but for the truth, a truth that had been buried beneath years of media speculation, criminal theories, and missteps by the authorities. The public's attitude towards the McCanns shifted over the years, and they were no longer just grieving parents. They became symbols of resilience and courage. Despite being scrutinized, judged, and doubted by the press, they kept their heads high. They continued to speak out in the hope that one day someone would come forward with the information that could bring them peace. For them, this wasn't just about their own suffering. It was about every parent who had to face the horror of their child's disappearance. They knew that they were not alone in their pain. Madeleine's case had become a symbol for all missing children and families who had been left in the dark, desperate for answers. Despite the media's turn away from the case, new documentaries and books kept the story alive. The mystery remained a powerful subject for debate, and the idea that Madeleine McCann could still be out there sparked heated discussions. Some still held on to the hope that the case would one day be solved, that the world would wake up and finally uncover the truth. But as time wore on, it became clearer that the case would likely remain unsolved, an open wound that would never completely heal. While the world may have moved on, for the McCanns, the loss was permanent. The idea of Madeleine being out there, somewhere, still haunted them. They were now forced to live with the uncertainty, something no parent should ever have to face. What was once an overwhelming surge of hope for Madeleine's return had now transformed into the painful reality of living without knowing what had happened to her. Was she alive? Was she being kept somewhere? Or had she tragically lost her life? These questions would remain unanswered for the foreseeable future. And yet, the McCanns, despite everything, still held out hope. They were living with the painful truth that some mysteries may never be solved, but still, they fought for justice for their daughter. The case of Madeleine McCann had taken on a mythic quality, with theories surrounding it growing more elaborate over time. For some, it represented a tragic failure of the justice system, a reminder of how deeply flawed the world's institutions could be. For others, it remained a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of children, a story of lost innocence that could happen to any family. Madeleine McCann was no longer just a missing child. She had become a symbol, her disappearance a mirror for everything that was wrong with the world. As the years continued to pass, the Madeleine McCann case had already embedded itself into the fabric of modern history. With each passing anniversary, more questions arose. Where is Madeleine? And what happened on that fateful night in May 2007? The case became a national and global symbol of loss, mystery, and the flaws of investigative systems. However, despite the many theories and public interest, the answers seemed just as elusive as the day she vanished. In 2020, 13 years after her disappearance, a new lead emerged from German authorities. They identified Christian B., a convicted pedophile with a history of crimes in Portugal, as a person of interest. German police suggested that he may have had a connection to Madeleine's disappearance, especially considering that he was in the Algarve area at the time. The news sparked a brief moment of hope for the McCanns and the public alike. Could this finally be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? But despite the media frenzy and the renewed interest in the case, there was no direct evidence linking Christian B to the abduction. The hopeful lead fizzled out just as quickly as it appeared, leaving the McCanns once again to grieve the crushing reality that they were still no closer to answers. Despite the lack of progress, the McCanns, with unwavering determination, refused to give up their fight for justice. They continued to speak publicly about Madeleine, urging the world to remember her name and to never let the case fade into the shadows. The world had moved on in many ways, but for the McCanns, time had stood still. Every day that passed felt like a fresh wound in their hearts, and each new theory or lead, though fleeting, brought them a brief moment of hope before the truth was inevitably swallowed up by uncertainty. But Madeleine's story didn't just linger in the hearts of her parents. It stayed with everyone who had followed the case, who had felt the same sense of helplessness and frustration. Her disappearance became a warning, a reflection of the fact that even in the most modern, connected world, some mysteries remain unsolved. The case highlighted the limitations of investigative systems, the human tendency to speculate, and the devastating effects of living without closure. Over the years, documentaries, books, and podcasts have continued to examine the case from every angle, trying to piece together the fragmented evidence and contradicting theories. But each new attempt to solve the case seemed to bring more questions than answers. For the McCanns, the need for justice remained their driving force, but they began to realize that finding their daughter might not be enough. They needed to understand why it had happened, who was responsible, and how their lives had been changed forever by a single tragic event. The fight for truth was no longer just about finding Madeleine. It was about finding a way to make sense of the overwhelming, unspeakable loss that had been inflicted upon their family. Madeleine McCann's disappearance is still one of the most haunting stories in modern history. It represents the pain of lost innocence, the helplessness of parents who were unable to protect their child, and the heartbreak of a world that has yet to find closure. Despite the best efforts of the McCanns and countless others involved in the investigation, the truth remains out of reach. Where is Madeleine McCann? The answer is a question that will never be fully answered, a question that lingers like an open wound in the heart of every person who has followed her story. As the years go by, Madeleine's name continues to be remembered on missing child posters, on social media, and in the hearts of those who still believe that she is out there somewhere. The hope that one day the truth will come to light keeps her memory alive. The McCann family's journey is one of resilience, of fighting against the odds, and of never giving up on the hope of closure. Though the world may have moved on, Madeleine McCann's story is far from over. Her legacy will continue to inspire the search for justice, even if the ultimate truth is forever out of reach. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Madeleine McCann's case will ever be solved?